So can I welcome you to the fifth of our six-part series on populism and science. And this is hosted by the Oxford Martin School. It's part of the 20-year anniversary of the Institute of Population Ageing, who celebrates 20 years. But we're delighted that we were able to combine this with the Oxford Martin School. And we're particularly delighted that tonight we have both Lillian Martin, James Martin's widow, and Joy Jairan, her daughter, with us. And Lillian is a very, very active and influential thinker in the Oxford Martin School's future. And it is wonderful that you were able to be with us. And just to remind you, for those people who haven't been here before, that the Oxford Martin School has some 35 research institutes looking very much at the future of the 21st century, and they range all the way from the hard sciences across social sciences into the arts and humanities, a real multidisciplinary approach to the 21st century, which is exactly what James Martin hoped his school would become. But just to also fill in a little bit about this series, around populism and science, the idea that as we have had a more populist culture as well as series of sort of governments emerging over the last couple of decades in particular, the role of the internet and social media we know has also contributed to this, that there has been this growing view that elites are not just political elites, but also that people from economics, people from the arts, from culture, and scientists are now part of that elite group that can be exploiters being opposed to the public. And if we have that kind of dynamic, how do we as scientists work with policymakers and with others to ensure that the science that we produce and the evidence we produce is understood by the public and also has a good reciprocal relationship, particularly in the field of policy? So we started with the Cabinet Office, with Policy Lab. We've had a couple of seminars which have looked at the role of the journalist. And last week we had looking at framing of information. And I'm absolutely delighted that tonight we have Robin Niblett, who is the director of Chatham House, and who's going to come and talk to us about the role of government in this new world that we find ourselves in. So Robin's going to talk for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then as usual we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We talk here because they said you were going to walk around and talk. In London we don't tend to go for longer than about 20 minutes these days. I've forgotten, you go to university, you've got to speak for 40. I'll probably ramble if I start walking around and go for 50 instead and make a mistake. But just to organise my thoughts a little bit, let me work off a few notes here. And Sarah, delighted to have this opportunity to come and speak at the Martin School, which I've not had the opportunity to speak at before. I did meet Ian Goldin, the first director, when I was working in Washington, D.C., and he was coming here to take the position, and got to see him in his nice new office downstairs, but I didn't get upstairs. So fantastic venue, great initiative, and a great opportunity for me to come and speak at it. You asked me, Sarah, we met in Paris, 2 years, I don't know how long ago. Just after Brexit. Well, that's 2 years ago now, I'm afraid. It doesn't seem like it, but it is. So it was just after the Brexit vote, so nearly two years ago. And you came back to me afterwards and said there was a comment I'd made, actually to the FT at one point, that one of my big frustrations as an analyst of Europe, and that's where I kind of started off my, I'm not an academic now, but let's call it my early academic work, had been on European integration. And I had this, it just struck me, and I've been frustrated for a long time about this, that governments needed to be more candid with their citizens about what's going on. And you've all heard the famous phrase, but I will repeat it here, that I think it was Jean-Claude Juncker said when he was still Prime Minister of Luxembourg, that we all know what we've got to do, but we don't know how to get re-elected if we do it. And I just don't think that's a good enough excuse. It's a nice phrase to use and it's cute, but we are living right now through the results, in my opinion, of successive governments of whichever political stripe not owning up to, and I'll coin a phrase, to the loss of control that engaging with a globalized economy involves. So the title I was given, and I will follow the title I was given, governments across Europe need to be more candid with their citizens. What do I mean by that, and how can they be more candid, and what will they do? So it's going to be a bit of a ramble through where I think we are today in Europe, some of the challenges that we face in the next year or two. But as I work at a policy institute, and I'm speaking at another policy institute, I will just throw out a few ideas, at least of how we might think about the future at that time. So it was 2013, in fact, as I look back, when I made this comment about governments needing to be a bit more candid. So well before Brexit, and really, I suppose, in the middle of the worst period of the financial crisis as experienced in Europe. And it, as I said, reflected my long-standing sense that European politicians had not been accurate, and in particular in implying that, to use Boris Johnson's phrase, citizens in Europe would be able to have their cake and eat it in the beginning of the 21st century, as they had certainly in the 50s, 60s, maybe into the 70s, in continental and in Europe and in the United Kingdom. One way that we've often judged our governments by is, are they sustaining the welfare state that has become part of the self-identification of all European citizens, that we are fortunate enough as Europeans, unlike Americans, to live in welfare states of one sort or another. They all have different characters to them, as we know, across Europe, but they are broadly linked together by a sense that the government will take care of us and will step in at the appropriate moments to protect us against the chill winds, in particular of globalization. That standards of living can be sustained, that standards of welfare can be sustained in the future as they were before. And that kind of period in the 1950s was not exceptional, despite the fact that it was, because that was an era where Europe had a demographic dividend, which has been slowly leaching away in the intervening decades. And most importantly, it was the period where we really contributed the value-added element to much of the global economy, along with the United States and a number of other Western countries. And the metaphor that has always come to my mind is that governments have implied to their people that globalization was a sort of linear process, like a train heading up a hillside, little carriages. And globalization is good because everyone gets taken up the hillside together. We all move from a particular level of global economic welfare to another over time if we partake in the processes of globalization, in particular market opening, etc. And yet the implication, never quite written explicitly this way, but certainly believed by European citizens, is that we as European citizens would always be in the first carriage. Yeah? If you were Chinese or African, you'd move up, but you'd be in the second carriage or the third carriage, because obviously that was the benefit, is that the relative gains would continue to be distributed the same way as they had at the beginning. But of course, as in particular after the late 1990s into the 2000s, China joined the WTO, the collapse of communism in countries across much of the world giving up command economies, opening flows to capital, to finance the sharing of technology, investments in primary and secondary education around the world, better levels of education. Guess what's happened? Yes, the carriages have gone up the hill, but the passengers have got pretty mixed up. And you might have a few Europeans or Americans or Canadians or whatever is in the front row, the front carriage, but they're sharing those carriages with people who previously, to continue my metaphor, were in the second or third carriages. And people who were in the first are finding themselves drifting backwards in terms of their relative benefits. And, at no point can I think of a time where government leaders, and I'll focus on Europe because that's the area I know better, have admitted that unleashing globalization was going to require really quite fundamental changes in the political constructs, the political economies of European countries in that process. And today, we are paying the price of that political fecklessness. And the question is, are we coming out of paying that price, or are we still going to be paying it? Have we got out of that inability to recognize the truth or not? So where are we today? I mean, where I would say we are today is that we are certainly not out of the woods. That loss of trust in the truth-telling of our political leaders has not been recovered. And, it's easy, certainly in my business, to grab at the latest bit of news to prove the point. But the Italian elections are an interesting reminder. It wasn't that everyone went to the right or the left. They just fragmented away from the center to the extremes at either end of the Italian political spectrum and declared that they want change. We've seen in Austria, the Austrian elections, the partnership with the Freedom Party there that Sebastian Kurz has had to engage in. We've seen a number of electoral changes in Central Eastern Europe, but the wind still seems to be in the sails of populist leaders, whether it's in the recent Czech elections, the more recent Slovenian elections. I would argue, and I don't think anyone here would deny this, that populism, the loss of confidence in those established political parties has not been recovered at this stage. But this despite the fact that at the tail end of 2017, I'd even say into the front end of 2018, the narrative has wanted to be different. The migration crisis has been contained. Most of those populist risks that were listed as the big hinge points of 2017 after the Brexit vote, the Dutch elections, the German elections, the French elections, all came out in the end on the right side. Growth has picked up, economic growth across the EU, exceeding any other part of the OECD. Greece and Portugal back in the sovereign debt markets. Growth and investment in Europe has been at actually quite impressive levels in 2017, over 4.5%. Foreign investment still flowing in across Europe. What's not to like? But I would say these are all temporary. Oh, not temporary. They're not structural changes. These are more symptoms of a benign moment rather than reflections of governments having got their hands back on the reins of the future of Europe. Why? Number one, Europe is that much more dependent upon and reflective of the overall state of the global economy because of its much larger exposure than many other economies to the global trading system, and in particular through Germany and through some of its most successful economies. It reflects on whether the rest of the world is doing well or not. And the fact is, in 2017, we had a return to global growth rates of 4%, and importantly, a return to trade as a proportion of global growth being back up at those levels of the 1990s and 2000s. And so a lot of this benign moment that has been celebrated in speeches by Jean-Claude Juncker and others now as President of the European Commission, to me, runs the risk of simply grabbing a particular moment in the economic cycle and declaring that it's a reflection of overall victory. The vulnerabilities are for all of us to see, not least in the fact that in the United States, a severe storm has not only brewed but been unleashed. The specific actions of Donald Trump in terms of taking on this benign trade environment as part of his domestic agenda and the impact that could have on global growth. We will see what happens through the course of this year. But the United States is far less exposed to the global trading system than we are in Europe. And America can afford to gamble, or certainly Donald Trump can afford to gamble with his zero-sum approach to the global economy in ways that we cannot. And even as he gambles and drives a kind of stimulus as well in the US economy and starts to knock up US interest rates potentially as a result, there's an additional knock-on effect into the global economy as those more vulnerable emerging markets, and we've seen this in Argentina already and in Turkey, also Turkey, for example, a very important market again for the European Union, they are also hitting some very chill winds. And we forget as well that the EU, an economy that tends to do well when global energy prices are low, had a 2017 where they were exceptionally low. This year, they're back up to being relatively high again. And we'll see whether they stay at that level, but the impacts on inflation, the impacts on costs of products, and on simply what is in the pocketbook of European citizens is going to be negative. So the point I wanted to make here at the beginning is that I've sensed throughout Europe, and certainly in the discourses I hear when I travel to Brussels or Paris or Germany or wherever, and there are some seats at the front that say reserved but won't be reserved, I think, if you want to, that there is a real risk that we are spinning a story that is a way of avoiding the truth about the global economy at this time and the vulnerabilities that Europe faces. So how ready are we if the storm clouds were to break again over Europe? First of all, I'm going to give credit where credit is due. It's not as if through that Eurozone crisis, European governments and institutions did nothing. As always, they did step forward and take some important steps in creating supervisory mechanisms for the banks, a common resolution authority, infrastructure fund, European stability mechanism. There have been plenty of steps taken to try to improve the resilience of European economies to these chill winds. But, and as you can imagine, my but list is going to be a little larger than that comment. My sense is that Germany, on whom so much of Europe's continued, current economic recovery and survival through the Eurozone crisis depended, seems still to be operating on the fumes of the reforms that they undertook in the late 90s and early 2000s, the so-called Hartz IV reforms. And even though we've think of Angela Merkel and her victory in the latest grand coalition as an element of stability, what we have is her now taking on board a SPD that's going to try to buy the credibility of its voters back again from its remarkably low levels in the last elections by, in a way, in my opinion, ignoring the realities of the challenges facing the German economy going ahead. In France, obviously, we have a better story. Macron, who, at least to my taste, is somebody who is recognizing and telling it like it is to the French electorate, and at least through the context of the presidential and assembly elections has done reasonably well on that front. But we will see early stages yet on his effort after the failures of Sarkozy and Hollande to take on the reforms that France need to do. Spain and Ireland, a bit more resilient, generally an environment that is in play, I would say, at the moment, but vulnerable nonetheless. Why is it still vulnerable? For the simple reasons that I don't think many of the real structural challenges facing Europe, the ones that I said in 2013 governments were not being candid about, I don't hear them actively undertaken in any of the public debates. At the core of it is this question that I think we're going to have to address at some point. Can Europe sustain the welfare state that it put in place back in the 50s and 60s, and as I indicated at the beginning, I fear is not going to be sustainable in the future. Now, you can have quite a big debate about this, and I wrote a paper with Ian Begg back in 2015, Ian Begg of the LSE, and partly an associate fellow of Chatham House, where we made the fair point that some of the statistics about how vulnerable Europe is to the heavy burden of its welfare states can be overplayed. Angela Merkel tried to, I think, briefly shake up the German and European voters with her famous trifecta of statistics, which you probably heard, that Europe accounts for 7% of world population, 25 roughly % of world GDP, and about 50% of welfare spending. It was a way of saying this is not sustainable. But that statement, I suppose, is self-evident because those numbers will change in any case as China and other emerging markets are forced to start spending more on welfare themselves. And plus, it's a slightly strange measure because America does not spend, obviously, nearly as much as Europeans do on welfare, and yet they end up spending a lot more in terms of pure costs of GDP on those welfare elements, the best example being in healthcare, where in Europe we spend anywhere between 9 and 11% of GDP on healthcare, and in America it's close to 19%. So you've got some pretty, you've got perversities in a very different system in America that reflect themselves economically as well. But nonetheless, we have not reflected the fact that aging societies in Europe are continuing to pose an unsustainable pressure on the welfare systems as they currently exist. And again, I think you probably here know the statistics. We're rising from roughly a 19% proportion of those over 65 in Europe in 2015, going up to about 28% projected by 2050. The figures are particularly extreme in Central Eastern Europe, in Germany and in Italy. And we are going to be taking on those extra costs while debt levels, apart from in Germany, are still at a 90% roughly average across the Eurozone. So we're very little fuel in the tank to be able to take on those added costs, which then reflect themselves as well in healthcare costs at the same time. We may be creating more flexible economies, more women in the workforce, but getting more women in the workforce will require greater investment in childcare facilities. Those elements, again, not fully baked into the future. There is a sort of polarization in the nature of work taking place in Europe as well between those who are connected to the global economy and can draw some of the benefits of continuing global growth, and those who are still, one might say, trapped in low growth, non-traded sectors of the economy across Europe. And lurking underneath all of this, of course, is the changing nature of work as technology, automation in particular, starts to draw away some of those well-paid middle-class jobs that really were the heyday of that mid-period in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s in Europe, and that took with them and brought with them the tax intake that enabled us to afford the welfare systems that we had. So, I am not confident, and I have not seen across European governments yet a sufficient willingness to be candid with the electorates about the challenges that Europe still faces, even as we're drifting out of this Eurozone crisis period. What is it that is being said? And I'll be a little bit, I'll set this up a little bit as a picture that I hear from leaders in Brussels in particular, which is European integration is going to come to the rescue. I certainly can't escape the latest figures that keep coming through on my email feeds about the latest Eurobarometer figures that show that popular confidence and favorability ratings in the European Union are rising again, 35% in 2016, 40% last year, now up above close to the 50% figure according to the latest Eurobarometer levels. But the idea that on the back of those favorability attitudes, you're going to be able to build a case for European integration as the answer for greater productivity and ability to sort of in and of themselves drive greater growth and therefore affordability for the welfare systems across the European Union, strikes me as against the grain of where politics in Europe stand today. In most governments, whether those are ones that are doing well economically or those who've been doing less well economically, the demand is for greater national control, not for ceding greater rights and greater control to EU institutions. A country like Germany is probably the best example of this conundrum, a country that flouted EU rules in allowing the the huge refugee crisis and the huge refugee flows that came in 2015 that then tried to use and impose, in many cases, EU rules to share that refugee burden around with those countries that refused to take it, that is now threatening to punish those countries that did not play the right role on sharing the burden of the refugee flow into Europe by redistributing the next multi-annual financial framework away from cohesion on GDP per capita and more towards an inclusion of values-based elements into that calculation, while at the same time resisting the Macron approach for long-term stabilization of the Eurozone through common deposit insurance schemes and undermining, you might say, the common energy market by wanting to have a second pipeline of Russian gas coming through the north of Germany into Europe. I'll just take that one example. I mean, there's enough contradictions baked in there for it to be quite a toxic environment within European Council meetings that are likely to take place over the course of this year. As part of my work at Chatham House, I have to moderate sessions from time to time with European leaders. And I did one session earlier on this year where it struck me that there was another divide emerging among European governments about the idea of doing a new drive of European integration as a way of overcoming these structural limits to growth, which is not just the creditor-debtor divide, which has been discussed at length over the last 2-3 years, not just the East-West divide between those countries in the East that are much more sovereignty-minded and some of those in Western Europe that are more federally minded, but also increasingly a division re-emerging between the big and the small. At this particular dinner that I moderated in Davos this year, it was interesting where we had the two principal speakers that had been laid on for the program were French and German. And the constant muttering coming from the tables that had the, if I remember rightly, the Estonians, the Swedes, and the Danes about not wanting a return to Franco-German leadership of the European Union was noticeable to me at that time. Underneath the national level, I'd say there's another dynamic going on, which is the one of a misunderstanding of European public opinion and a habit of putting it into those who are in favor of more European integration and those that are not in favor of more European integration, and trying to weigh the two of them up as providing the consent, should we say, for EU governments to undertake greater European integration, as I said, as the answer to delivering greater growth. In fact, we ran a very interesting study in collaboration with 9 other think tanks across Europe last year, where we polled 10 EU countries, including the UK, on attitudes to European integration. And we ended up breaking the categories down into tribes based on a combination of attitudes to their styles of life, their attitudes to where Europe fitted into their sense of ambition, their sense of expectation, and their senses of fear about the future. And you can get this online. There's a sort of Tribes of Europe part on the Chatham House website. And there's also a little app. Well, on an app, there's a little thing you can go in there and all find out which tribe you belong to if you want. It takes about 90 seconds to take it if you want, or not more than a couple of minutes. And I think it's a kind of interesting thing to do. So do try it out if you want. But the results that we drew these tribes off had as by far the biggest category the hesitant Europeans. 36% of those that we polled, I think roughly 10,000 people polled across 10 different European countries, considered themselves hesitant, not sure whether Europe was going to deliver the answers they wanted or not. 23% were contented, but contented meant, if you break it down, not wanting more. They were kind of happy with where things are, quite suspicious in particular about deeper integration around the migration and movement of labor area. The rejectors at 14% were the next biggest category. And we had, austerity rebels and frustrated pro-Europeans in there. But the federalists, again, it's all laid out there how that is gauged, only accounted for 8%. So I would just say that the way Europeans think about Europe has nuances in it that we need to be careful that we capture. The danger of kind of building fair weather institutions again, if we were to do that in this next phase after the Eurozone crisis, having built fair weather institutions in Schengen and in the Eurozone back in the 80s and into the 90s, would be a big risk. Okay, I'm on 30 minutes here, so I've got to stop in a second. Let me finish up by just noting two things. What do I think are some of the main kind of contextual dangers out there, and what can we do about it? I would say one element that worries me is that there's a habit right now to conflate populism exclusively as a threat to liberalism without appreciating the extent to which the failures of liberalism have given rise to the reality of populism today. A colleague of ours, Angelos Chrysolegos, Greek, a guy who did a fellowship at Chatham House and has stayed in the UK, or I think he's going to Harvard now, wrote I think a very good piece that just went up in the last day or two on our website about precisely this theme, and I'm taking it from him. I think it's absolutely essential that we don't use our quite justified fears and complaints about the populist messages that are coming out from many political leaders across Europe right now, that we do not use these as a shield for not recognizing the failures of, let's call it, the liberal choices that were made over the last 15 to 20 years. Secondly, we've got to make sure that we do not assume that the old political parties are going to be able to sort of reinvent themselves automatically as the providers of solutions. There's going to have to be some elements of catharsis, if I'm using that word rightly, in how we develop this. The rise of social media, the new tribalisms, the echo chambers are going to make it very difficult for the parties of the past to carry us through to a positive future. And while we're trying to grapple with this period of transition politically, we have an unbenign international environment, as I mentioned earlier, of an America that's not there to help, but even more importantly, that is actually stoking the flames of the populism and of undermining the credibility of the established political parties in Europe. The Steve Bannon tour of Central Eastern Europe is, I think, actually quite an important development to watch out for as we go forward. And with Russia waiting in the wings and taking advantage wherever it can, I don't want to go on too much about that right here, right now, I think we are in a vulnerable environment. So what do we do to finish up with? Three things, and I do not have this, I literally put these ideas together as part of the challenge of this talk that Sarah asked me to give. So I look forward to fleshing out my thoughts with the help of your questions and comments later. But it strikes me there are at least three things we need to do. Number one, I'll go back to my opening theme. We've somehow got to find, or we have to be, and that's a big question as well, the people who demand more candid answers from our politicians, and we need politicians who are more candid. You get what you ask for. We've tended to vote for people who've given us easy answers. But we need to recognize we're all going to have to work longer. We're going to probably have to move to welfare societies where we have to shift to sort of social investment models that are, as we said in the report with Ian Begg, capacitating rather than compensating in their approach, that drive people to try to enhance their human capital rather than sit there as protecting people from the chill winds of globalization, taking on very tough educational reforms, which still prove to be remarkably difficult in countries as diverse, obviously, as Spain, France, and Italy, so that we have that human capital. In any case, there's a huge, boring, technical set of reforms that need to be undertaken across Europe. Either we're going to have to demand that from our governments, or we're going to have to go into politics, more of us, to try and deliver them, as Macron did by drawing a whole bunch of new people into politics who'd not done it before. Or otherwise, we're going to have to let the populists play for a bit in the sandpit, with all of the risks that come with that. I'd rather see Five Star and Lega Nord have a crack at it than try to drive them out through some contortion of constitutional rights in Italy. These voices need to be heard. I could make some comments about Brexit in that space as well, but let's save that up for the Q&A if there's time. Second point, and I think this is a really difficult thing, but it's something we're doing at Chatham House, we have to modernize democracy. We're going to have to find a way to use digital connectivity, a far more fluid form of, to use the Pirate Party term, liquid democracy, however one might want to define that. We have to find a way to consult, engage in a much more consistent and ongoing way than we do currently in politics. I don't think we can go back to the kind of industrial style tribal politics of the past. And lastly, and again, this is not an idea that I've fleshed out in my mind, but I think I know what I mean by it. Those doing European integration, Britain won't be part of it, but I think we can comment on it, or I can comment on it as a Brit. We need to do more and less, rather than more or less. Because if there's one of the insights I took away from our study that we did a year and a half ago now with that data, is that there is not, I don't think, a hard core of countries that want more Europe, more European integration, and an outer core, let's call them, that want less. What there is there are groups of people cutting across all of those countries that want more in certain areas, digital protection, maybe greater energy integration, greater protection against terrorism and organized crime, GDPR even perhaps, and that maybe want less in other areas, intervention in tax, possibly in monetary integration, probably definitely in movement of labor and the kind of deals that need to be done on migration. So there's going to be a real challenge to think about how you do more and less integration when it doesn't put countries into groups. It really is about how you think about society across Europe in that case. So let me stop there. Bit of a ramble, but a nice challenge, Sarah. So thank you for giving it to me, and look forward to your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, and a lot of what you said has fitted in beautifully with some of the other themes that have come out, and particularly around the idea of echo chambers and the role of government to work in that kind of a society. But taking you right back to this challenge we gave you, or I gave you right at the beginning, and the idea that governments have to be more candid, and in the new world of the internet and the expert public, where we can all actually find out information, even if we can't necessarily get to the truth of that. One thing I've been really struck by is that we still have governments who are used to raising expectations rather than being realistic. And I'm, as we were discussing, currently working in France for 6 months. And the difference between the British government, May, and Brexit, and what Macron is actually doing with the French people is striking. And at the moment, he is being very candid and very open, and is trying to force through some very, very difficult reforms. But my impression is that the French people are actually responding very well. I mean, we've got the student demonstrations and we have the railway strike, but actually that's almost a sort of side show that's going on. Is that something that you feel that we actually do have a leader who is trying to be candid with his population?
Well, I think in just to contrast those two examples, I could not be more frustrated personally with the approach taken by Theresa May personally and the government at the beginning of the dialogue that we've had to engage in here in the United Kingdom after the Brexit referendum vote, or after the EU referendum vote that led to a Brexit. With this sunny upland, we will make an opportunity of it. It will be a success. Could we not have treated the British public in a more grown-up way and say, look, we've made a call, or a majority has made a call, and my job is to deliver it. Brexit means Brexit, doesn't matter what phraseology. It's going to be a tough journey. You don't pull out of 40 years of integration without having to take some knocks things, but I'll get you through, and then we will make things happen. After that, I'm going to set it up and get the best possible deal we can so that there's an opportunity for us to get to the sunny uplands. But this banal debate that we've had, the Prosecco debate, if you want to call it, that we're now having to row back from constantly. It's either brilliant, because people are now getting frustrated and think it's such a mess that you might end up with some type of kind of reversal. I don't happen to personally believe it's going to happen, but there are some people whose hope is up on this front. But more likely, it's just another loss of confidence and really potential greater radicalization of politics in Britain. Now, I agree, Macron is the contrast, but I do feel, Portugal's had a reasonably good experience as well. But if I look across the totality of continental Europe, and honestly, I don't have the time to get to know each country individually, but to the extent that I travel a bit and have a feel and so on, and I'd love to hear other people's viewpoints as well, we keep having sort of one exception that keeps trying to do it. Like Germany did it when no one else was doing it, because it had to. In the Hartz IV reforms, Schröder, SPD still haven't got back into government from the tough calls that they took at that point. And in a way, Merkel's almost been slightly cutting away at some of the difficult calls that were made at that time and trying to sort of compromise her way to make sure that the CDU were the party of government forever in that process. So Macron is kind of the Schröder then. And boy, did France need somebody to step this forward. As I said, the people were ready for it. But if I look where the Netherlands are in their debate right now, Finland, Italy, Britain itself, okay, I'll be careful where I go to British politics. I'm happy to talk about it. I've got nothing to hide. But I just think there's a debate here where there's a lot of wishful thinking going on both political parties. So, yes, I'm delighted to see Macron. I really hope it works. If it works, maybe it'll give some fire in the belly of some others. But, I don't think that Mark Rutte would have won and knocked Wilders off if he hadn't had that spat with Erdogan at that particular time. It really felt to me like that turned the Dutch election and just got him over the line. And Geert Wilders still got a huge, in relative terms, turnout of that vote. So I'm cautious, optimistic about Macron, but cautious about Europe.
Right. Let's open it up and let's start with the question there. And then we have the man there.
Yeah, thank you. So you made a point about populism.
Well, where are you from, if you don't mind? Just always, not that I want to presuppose that where you're from dictates a bit of interesting.
From South France, Toulouse.
France.
Yeah. Well, so you made a point about populism within liberalism, etc. So I was curious about how do you define populism?
How do I define populism? I've not defined it in my... I think I would define populism in two ways. In terms of the specific solutions that are offered, they are simplistic, not simple. Simplistic solutions, policy prescriptions to complex problems that are designed either knowingly to fail, but to gain power, or the people are delusional and actually believe it. So to me, populist solutions are ones that either are cynically or delusionally offering answers that will not deliver the change that they're meant to deliver, but really answer to gut instincts amongst the people. So that would be my first part of the definition. Yeah, what would be a populist platform, for example? But populism is an ideology, and again, Angelos Chrysolagos, I think, put it well in the way he articulated in this piece. In the end, is about majoritarian rule. It's about the right of the majority to not only be heard, but to rule, and the subservience of institutions to the rule of the majority. And that is really dangerous in my mind. I mean, uber dangerous. So which is why I think, populism needs to be called out, not just because of the, in my opinion, incorrectness of the prescriptions, but also because of where it can lead.
I should remind people that this is being streamed and will be on YouTube. So if you don't want to have your question streamed, please just don't ask it because we can't edit it out.
You should have told anyone, that would be good.
I know.
I can't edit back anything I said, can I?
I mean, we've got lots of questions, but can I just build up? You talked about liquid democracy.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little?
Well, probably not. I mean, it was to me, it just feels like a good phrase. It was the phrase. I think I'm right. There are a lot of people here I know because I recognise some of the folks here who are more knowledgeable than I am on aspects of European politics. If I remember, it was the Pirate Party in Berlin that first came up with the term when they had their brief moment in the sun in Germany, 4 years ago, something like that. I was talking to a member of the also called Pirate Party from Iceland at a dinner recently. Actually, the first question I asked him was, why is it called a Pirate Party? It's kind of, are you sort of going to storm, you're storming the traditional parties and it's the Pirate Party? He had this great answer. He said, no, it's ironic. And I went, what do you mean it's ironic? And he said, well, people call themselves Christian Democrats. They're not Christian, they're not particularly Democrat. They call themselves, the social Democrats, as in, I think, or Democrat socialists in Sweden, who are far right. So we thought we'd call ourselves the party. The Pirate Party is an ironic statement. I guess that's an aside. But I liked it. It made me want to be rather Pirate Party-ish. But my understanding of liquid democracy is the idea that people do not have to be tribal, that you agglomerate consent and popular will around issues as they arise. You mobilize it around a solution or a moment of policy decision-making, but that we as citizens have the right to flow away then from the group that may have then shepherded that policy through, and you might liquidly go over to what might normally be designated as the left, or even a populist, the left or the right, as the right solutions come along. So it's a rather worrying approach if you're a party, because it means you don't own your voters, if you see what I'm saying. And it is much more in keeping, potentially, with the time of a digital society that is used to being able to, like, swipe, Tinder their way through their politics.
So Brexit has made Britain much more of a liquid democracy.
I think definitely. Yeah. If you think of even, some of the Brexit regretters or Remain, what the hellers.
We have lots of questions, so we have.
I've got to try and be quick.
So, Robbins, thank you for talk. My name is Robert, and I'm originally from Devon. Before you came on, so Alan Duncan, the Foreign Minister. It's not the Foreign Minister. He's under Foreign. I can't remember his exact position, but he's in the Foreign Ministry. He actually said that there is likely to be a referendum on a parliamentary vote on the final referendum Brexit bill. So that's brand new. That came out an hour ago.
Sorry, who said it was?
So Alan Duncan, in the Foreign Office. So I want to make 2 points. One on economic points. So I went to a talk with Sir Christopher Mayer, who used to be the British ambassador to the US. And he said that before he went to the US, he was actually ambassador in Germany. And he went to a talk with the Chancellor there in a small town, and they were selling the euro. So it was before the euro came in. And the Chancellor was actually lamenting the fact, he said, it's a shame the Brits aren't coming in on this because, it's just going to be us and the French. And he was like laughing about it. He said, well, that's the way it goes. He said, there's only chance you can give them a nudge. And he was like, oh, it's not really my job. And so on the way to America, he actually went to Paris and saw the British ambassador there, and also saw the French leader at the time, I think it was Jacques Chirac. And he said, it's a shame you Brits can't join the euro because you're going to leave us with the Germans. And he was laughing, saying, it's not really my policy, it's not really my area. And I think one of the problems you have with Europe is that that economic integration just isn't there. I mean, you go to a southern European country like Greece, it's completely different from Germany. And in many respects, the problem the euro has is that, and I don't wish it to fail, is that the DNA makeup of those economies is so vastly different. And if Greece were to drop out of the euro, it's not going to. Or if Germany were, the Deutschmark, if you were to reintroduce it, would appreciate by such a tremendous amount that the German economy would fail. And I think, and my point is, people need to be honest about that. Politicians need to be honest about that economic integration and why it might not work. And the second thing is, I've just come back from Greece. Please forgive me.
Just because we've got so many people.
I appreciate that. Just give me a minute. So I've just come back from Greece.
Can I just explain? There'll be lots of time afterwards for you to have for you to come up, but you asked a very interesting question, and let's ask Robin to finish it. And then if we can get people just to be quite quick, because we're really running out of time. Question.
So on the parliamentary vote, the parliamentary vote obviously is not a new thing because that's formally in place. So that's not a new statement that Theresa May has committed not only to a parliamentary vote but to a meaningful vote. Now the debate is what is meaningful. And there is clearly a chance that a second referendum may take place because, well, look, this all is so fluid and so mobile, I could say liquid, that what I can't quite see is what the second question would be. So part of the reason I think it's unlikely that we will have a second referendum, but not impossible, obviously, is in the end, I think most parliamentarians, including those who do not want Britain or did not want Britain and would prefer Britain not to leave, will not fear too much the political impact of making that decision, of forcing the country to have a second vote. And on convergence, what I would say about convergence is that there's huge gaps of convergence within states. In many cases, within states, it's even bigger than between states. So I don't think that... I'm less critical of the failures of convergence because I can see that the process of European integration does impose some disciplines on countries that need the Deus Ex Machina of Brussels to drive them to take decisions that enable convergence, and there has been convergence. Central Eastern Europe countries are way better off before. So convergence has taken place, so I think it does happen. The problem is more about I'd say the political side, the non-economic side, is where the lack of appreciation of the need for identity politics to be given space to breathe, that's more my worry. So I'll come back to that point later on.
Brilliant. And this lady here, again, if you can be a little brief.
Hello, Calypso Nicolaidis from the DPIR here. Thanks for a great talk. And just a point, liquid democracy, Sigmar Baumann came up with this term just after the wall fell, and he was really worried about it all. And I think it illustrates his foresight. And I was thinking with the title of your talk that perhaps the challenge for democracy today is that we should be asking, isn't it the case that citizens are becoming candid with their politicians rather than asking politicians to be candid vis-a-vis? Well, we can do both. And that's the challenge, I think, of our postmodern 21st century democracy. But I wanted to ask you a question about the very important point you raised about the welfare state and our social models. To ask you whether you think that in this necessary reform, EU helps or hinders. And in this context, whether it could be argued that maybe Brexit will enable the UK to experiment in different ways about reforming the welfare state. What do you think?
I think, and thank you for the reminder of where liquid democracy came from, and I like this idea of citizens being much more candid than the other way around, and that's maybe that the demand will drive the change. Yeah. So if we are more candid, maybe the governments will start being more candid back. So it's a very good point. I think the EU, just a quick, simple answer for me would be that it's difficult for the EU to be an agent of real change and support of the European social market model per se. I know there's talk about an EU-wide unemployment insurance scheme, for example, and I think it is the case that although we mustn't tell any citizens in Germany that actually they've lent a whole bunch of money they may never get back again to various EU countries through the process of the Eurozone crisis, nonetheless, the ability of the EU to act as a leavener and as an agent of change across these incredibly diverse societies, where actually the ways of undertaking welfare provision reflects quite long structural, cultural differences, the flexicurity models of the northern European systems to the kind of favouring of people in work and the far more sceptical approach to flexible labour markets in many parts of the south of Europe. I just think almost impossible for the EU to bridge those differences, I think. So to me, the biggest value of the EU is as of a leverager of the competitive strengths of its member states. That the member states of Europe cannot ask the EU to solve the difficult problems. To the extent that EU member states make themselves fit, the EU makes us fitter and helps its member states be more successful. But what you cannot ask is the EU to make the states fit, including in the space of social welfare.
Brilliant. And the man next door.
I'm from Portugal, and you've mentioned about Portugal being a case of success, and I would like to understand to what were you referring to, whether it was how we reacted to our major economic crisis, or about the Portuguese government being candid to their citizens.
Look, you know Portugal better than I do. I mean, I was in Portugal 3 weeks ago for a conference. I just read up a little bit about it before I went out there, and it struck me that somehow remarkably a government that was able to channel the fears in a kind of the left, if I can call it that, about austerity, still managed to deliver enough austerity to be able to get the Portuguese economy back into a fit state. Partly benefit perhaps by a very robust export sections to the economy, where you're now running a current account surplus, as I understand it, or have done in a number of these previous years. Also being quite open to foreign investment in some ways and taking advantage of former colonies and a sort of some of Portugal's bigger global connectivity than other countries have got. So there must have been some very specific steps that were taken by the Portuguese government that gave it some extra capacity that maybe others had not undertaken. But it just strikes me that clearly it's possible. I wasn't really referring to whether the government was more or less candid, because I don't know. Frankly, I really don't know. You tell me. But whatever it did, it seems to have worked reasonably well. Now, with the tribulations that are coming in on the back of the Italian, sorry?
Not very candid, in my opinion.
It was candid or wasn't?
No.
Yeah. Then yeah. So then they did a good job by not being candid. So maybe people shouldn't be candid. I don't know.
And the man there.
You better be good if you're not going to be candid. Yeah.
I come from the States very sympathetically. So given historically that the EU, the big decisions for further European integration was largely taken in country houses over cigars and brandy away from prying eyes, it seems kind of like just desserts, the situation we're in now. I mean, it's almost as if the EU has gotten so good at hiding itself, it's no longer able to be seen. But I wanted to ask you about further than the sort of rational level of telling people what's going on, beyond transparency and candor, how much do you think identity is important here? This sort of felt aspect of belonging to the EU. As Alor said, you cannot fall in love with a single market, you need something else. How important is that something else for the future?
I mean, undoubtedly, European integration started out over cigars and brandy. I think the cigars and brandy have definitely drifted off in recent years, and certainly you've had politicians who've had to listen quite carefully to their people and be as responsive as they can. I mean, again, I think of Germany, which thanks to its federal system has, if you think of what Germany did in putting its taxpayers' money behind the resolution of the Eurozone crisis, I mean, it is remarkable in my mind. They haven't been entirely candid, as I said, because I think not all that money will necessarily come back. But if it doesn't come back over a very long period, then maybe, we'll be okay, because Germany will kind of grow its way out of the money that it's lent. But what they did at least do was get parliamentarians to debate and vote every single time on each of the loans that were done. And so rather than cigars and brandy, it had to be done publicly. And so I'm quite admiring of the way Germany undertook that process, not just letting the money go there. Admittedly, there was an austerity package to go with it, which has brought all sorts of anti-German feeling, and whether it's fair or not is a longer story, as Germany's benefited enormously from being a member of the Euro, as somebody else noted earlier. But nonetheless, so that's cigars and brandy. I do feel that any lack of connectivity and frustration about European integration in many cases have been enabled by national parliaments. I mean, there is this, one of the reasons I wish David Cameron had won the referendum is actually he got a fairly good, or fairly interesting, in my opinion, as a kind of hesitant European or a contented European. Actually, when I did the poll, I came out as a contented European. But I thought I might have been a hesitant European. But what David Cameron did is that he, in his 4 basket of issues, which I presume will not now happen because Britain's leaving the EU, one of them was bringing in increasing the amber light that national parliaments could put to EU legislation to a soft red light that could be brought now and again. But it was a way of saying national parliaments need to become much more engaged in the process of reviewing and authorising the process of European integration in a way that the role of the European Parliament needs to be checked, one might say, by the role of national parliaments. Now, those who favour more rapid European integration say, God, the last thing we want is European Parliament's getting too involved because it'll take too long, too many vetoes. But I would rather have a somewhat slow, dysfunctional process that has more ownership than a faster process that then has to create the ownership afterwards. And that ties into your identity point, because maybe I'm influenced by my Britishness on this. But it was very interesting on the polling stuff we did. And again, if you have a chance to look at this study we did on the future of European integration and the Tribes of Europe little mini report that came out afterwards, some of the clearest identifiers on your attitudes to European integration were not about whether you felt that you were being damaged by austerity or enabled by how good European integration had been for your economic prospects. They were around questions of identity, but they weren't always about national identity. They were about cultural identity. And the cultural identity, again, cuts across borders. My point earlier, that it's not about groups of nations as much as we're finding this in the Bannon phenomenon. Those who feel a sympathy to a more populist, however we defined it earlier, approach to politics, those who want a more metropolitan and cosmopolitan and inclusive approach to politics, that is the identity divide that Europe is having to deal with now, I think, more than the national identities, which is sort of, I think, sufficiently subsidiary at the moment.
And we have 2 last questions, the lady and then the man behind her.
So my question would be, I'm German, looking at the disparities of wealth that come with increased globalization. Do you think, had European politicians been more candid with their citizens earlier on about this, in what way do you think their approach would have been different? In what way would the agency, single countries, or the European Union as a whole towards the process of globalization and the way it engages with it would have been different?
I think that a certain element of candor, and you've got to be, you've got to get elected, you've got to be careful how far you take your candor. I think we made this point earlier about Portugal. There's political skill in knowing how far to take something, but a greater candor or greater admission of the challenges that European societies face in this era of greater globalization would, in my opinion, have legitimized a more intelligent sharing of financial resources. If you're going to raise tax, to be able to explain where the tax is going such that it's going to benefit society as a whole, because you're going to be putting money into training, for example, for those who lose their jobs because stuff goes offshore because multinationals find it cheaper to invest there, or the shift to the sort of call center, McDonald's type jobs as they were described. How do you get people out of that transitional phase and into the knowledge value added jobs? How can you get more people into self-employment? A more knowledge economy driven adjustment, investing in broadband. These are all expensive things to do, but in their expense, the justification for the expense and the willingness of those who are well off or better off to contribute to that expense might have been easier if you could explain what the overall social benefit had been, because there was an overall social risk. Because the one thing you find is that if a majority end up being disadvantaged, they will find a way to get revenge or get angry or get to where we are today. So I just think a greater element of candor might have given some of those political parties a greater range of policy tools and steps to have then taken as they'd gone along, rather than simply saying, we're just going to keep putting more into the pension system as it exists. I mean, the lack of intergenerational equity, this phrase that's discussed so much at the moment. I mean, older people might have been willing to take more of a hit on their pensions. Look at a country like the UK, which is stuck with a triple lock on pensioner rights through our own austerity period. Many pensioners probably would have said, you know what, not all, but some might have said, I'll take a hit on that because I understand that my money is going to go to invest so my grandchildren or my children have that greater opportunity to change their work. But that story was never given. I didn't hear it given. Maybe somebody else heard it. I never heard it.
And then there's the last question.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting statistic that kind of really supports your central thesis and the need for honesty, which is, in fact, I had to write something around this. It's one of Europe's own statistics, which shows the ratio, the forecast ratio, reduction in ratio between the pool of working age people and the people who are 65 plus, which currently is 4-1. And over the next 20-25 years is forecast to drop to 2-1. You know, that's a really scary thing. So in terms of tackling the elephant in the room, where do you think the UK is? You know, you hesitated to go too deep into UK politics, but where do you think the UK is relative in terms of tackling the elephant to the other major European economies?
It's a good question. I don't think we're in a very good place, actually. Again, it's a bit beyond my ken. I don't do a lot of work on UK politics. But a colleague of mine a few years ago did a report where, I don't know if she coined the term squeeze middle, but it was definitely in there before I'd heard it, at least politically. Maybe she picked it up from some of the events that we ran around it. But it was a good 4 or 5 years ago. When I worked in Washington, this is a bit of my thing that drove me crazy about the candid. When I worked in Washington, we ran in 1999 a project called the Global Aging Initiative, 1999, where the point was made that continental European societies in particular had pay-as-you-go pension systems that, because of the demographic change that you've just described, which is baked in, and even with the kind of immigration we've had in recent years, is not sufficiently material to change it, that the pay-as-you-go systems will blow up. They will not provide the amount needed. So you're going to have to raise retirement ages. Some have done it, some have not, and most have not. And you're also going to have to undertake all sorts of other steps. Now, the British government at that point, I remember David Willetts and others coming over saying, don't worry, we are ahead of everyone. We have not done the pay-as-you-go system. We're moving everyone into defined contribution systems. We're not relying on defined benefit. And our brilliant stock market is doing so well that when people invest their money in there, when we do our future obligations and look at our debt levels, we're not looking at these awful future potential debt levels that are going to be driven by unsustainable pay-as-you-go commitments by continental European governments. Brilliant. Flash forward to today, or even a little period forward, you look at the statistics of whether people's private savings are equal to what their retirement needs are, and it makes horrific reading in the United Kingdom. And guess what? The government still doesn't have those risks on its books, but what will happen, I'm in your world here, yes, I think I'm right in saying this, you are the wrong person answering the question, but never mind, I'll keep going, is that at some point the government will have to step in with all sorts of bailout systems for those people who don't have sufficient private savings. So to the best of my knowledge, Sarah, I don't think we're particularly well placed yet in the UK to manage this. And again, it's not one that I've heard described as bluntly as I've just put it. True or not?
No, I mean, I think we're in a better position than a lot of other Europeans, but in
because of our demographic profile, or because of the savings we've made?
Well, both. So as a country, we're better off because we did shift the burden away from the state onto the individual. Individuals within that country have got some difficult decisions to make about lifetime savings, working longer, and also reducing their expectations for what their retirement is going to be. And I think, for us, as the Institute of Population Aging, it's a wonderful question to end on. But I think it really comes back to this whole thesis about being candid, because the government has not been candid on that. And they've not been candid on migration, because Britain is one of the actually demographically youngest countries, along with France, because our wonderful migration that we have had and all the benefits has kept us young. Yes. And regardless of what happens with Brexit, and I'm still one of these people who just hopes there will be a people's vote, whatever happens, I think migration is going to be different going forward, and we will suffer, definitely demographically from it. We will become older much quicker than we would have. But thank you for finishing on that question. But before we thank Robin for a really stimulating talk, can I remind you that next week we're going to be looking at the role of the museum. We have 3 museum directors who are going to be with us on a panel looking at what about museums in the 21st century. And then also just to let you know that we will be extending this series into next term, so that's into October and November, where we'll be looking at the role of the institution. We will have 4 speakers. We already will have a speaker from the Royal Society. We will have Patrick Vallance, who is the new government chief scientist, replacing Mark Walpert, coming and talking about Go Science, and we'll have somebody from Wellcome and hopefully someone from a research council. So we'll be announcing that hopefully either next week or before the summer. But can we thank Robin for a fantastic talk?